Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 182 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Although I plan on wrapping up this version of Welcome to Geektown, I am still taking questions from listeners until I do so. And a recent question came in from Scott P., who previously asked about the colors in the DC universe, leading to episodes 121 and 122. This time he wrote, "Hey there. I've heard of the Raft in Marvel. What other super prisons are there in comics? And I may need more info on the Raft. I only know the name." As per my usual, I'll be sticking to Marvel and DC, but within those two, there are basically three categories of prisons to talk about. First off, there are real-life prisons that are used in stories. Next up will be super prisons, like the Raft mentioned in Scott's question. Then finally, there are the asylums, which are supposed to be for rehabilitating or helping people with some sort of mental illness who happen to commit crimes, but instead end up being another type of jail. While it's impossible to go into detail on every single one, I'll hit the ones that I think are basically the archetypes for the others in those categories. So, like I said, let's start with the real world. Although it's been out of use as a prison for over 60 years now, Alcatraz has been seen in both Marvel and DC, and has had a number of stories take place there. All the way back in Batman number 8 from 1942, Joker is sent to Alcatraz at the end of the Cross Country Crimes story. And in Marvel's books at that time, when it was still called Atlas Comics, some of the Human Torch and Submariner's villains were also incarcerated there. Since the site was shut down as a prison in 1963 and reopened as a national park in 1972, other stories have taken place there. One of the most recent being when Tony Stark, having been morally inverted in the Axis event of 2014/2015, turned the island into the new headquarters for Stark Industries, building a modern skyscraper there and renaming the place Stark Island. After Tony reverted to his more heroic self, he moved back to New York and Alcatraz was reverted to its original configuration. On the DC side of things, Alcatraz has been the site of a few Teen Titans storylines, as the team was based in San Francisco for a time, and later, in the mid-2000s, the DC version of Alcatraz was updated and reopened as a prison, albeit one of the super prisons that we'll talk about in a little bit. Technically, Rikers Island in the Marvel Universe, spelled with a Y, is different from Rikers Island, spelled with an I, located in our world in the Bronx. But they're close enough that I feel this fits in this category rather than one of the other two. DC has Strikers Island in Metropolis that serves a fairly similar function, though it also has a superhuman wing. Since many Marvel books take place in New York City, it makes sense to reference a local prison, but at the same time, so many prisoners in the books escape, and there are other stories about corruption and mistreatment that I can understand wanting to put a little bit of a disconnect between the real location and the fictional one. Of course, with the prison first appearing in Amazing Spider-Man number 4, written by Stan Lee, it could simply have been a typo that became canon. After all, this is the same period of time when Stan wrote Spider-Man's alter ego as Peter Palmer once, as well as forgetting if Hulk was Bruce or Bob Banner, the latter of which was retconned so that his full name is Robert Bruce Banner. Cletus Kasady, who later becomes Carnage, first appeared as Eddie Brock's, aka Venom's, cellmate at Rikers during a period when Eddie and his symbiote were separated. We'll hear more about Cletus later. Currently in the comics, this is where non-powered, or sometimes low-power, criminals are incarcerated, including many Daredevil cast members at one point or another, like the Kingpin, the Owl, Hammerhead, and even Daredevil himself. During David Mack's and then Ed Brubaker's runs on Daredevil, much of the action took place at Rikers. For street-level books like his, writers do their best to ground the characters in the real world. And so that includes using a real-life, or very close to real-life, prison. And the stories that take place in Rikers are similar to ones you'd see in Oz, Orange is the New Black, and other prison dramas, albeit with a bit of superheroics thrown in. Prisoners are able to interact there with each other and the prison staff in a way that allows for fights, bribes, blackmail, and other gritty stories that you just won't see in the other two types of prison that we'll be getting into next. Speaking of which, let's move on to these super prisons that Scott originally was asking about. The earliest appearance of a prison specifically devoted to superhumans that I can find is Avengers Annual number 15 in 1986, when we are introduced to the Vault. Originally shown to be hidden in one of the Rocky Mountains, it has since been retconned to be a more traditional-looking prison located near the base of the mountains in Colorado. Here, cells are built to contain super strong characters, or even nullify powers completely. For many years, the Vault was the only officially sanctioned prison for superhumans, and even got its own one-shot title, Avengers Death Trap: The Vault. So, as you can imagine, the list of former prisoners is incredibly long, including many of the Avengers themselves, as well as their biggest foes. Along the way, we learn the stories of the various wardens and guards, but the fact that the list of 22 at Marvel's Wiki includes 6 with the tag of deceased tells you how often various prisoners broke out or rioted, causing loss of life to said guards. In 1997, the Vault was closed down, while other facilities around the country were opened up, so as not to centralize all the criminal superhumans in one location. Sometime between then and 2004, it was reopened, but this time supplementing the superhuman prison system rather than being its sole location. Sticking with Marvel for the time being, the Raft is arguably the best known of the superhuman prisons these days, thanks of course to being seen in the MCU, specifically Captain America: Civil War. However, there's at least one big difference between the movie version and the one in the comics. In the MCU, the Raft appears to be located in the middle of the ocean, with no land in sight, and the entire facility can be raised above or dropped below the ocean's surface. However, the Marvel Comics Raft is an island prison located not too far from Rikers Island, between Queens and the Bronx. It was first mentioned in Alias number 24 in 2003, the book starring Jessica Jones written by Brian Michael Bendis, and was seen 2 issues later, but became a major plot point the following year in New Avengers number 1, when Electro, later found to be hired by a Skrull posing as Elektra, was able to blow the place open, allowing 42 supervillains to escape. That number would have been much greater had the characters who comprised the New Avengers team not happened to be present at the time. It was this event that inspired the formation of the New Avengers. After that, the prison was rebuilt, and a special bio-dampening field has been placed over it, which should prevent future escape attempts via superpowers. During the Superior Spider-Man story, when Doc Ock took over Peter Parker's body, discussed in episode 98, the island facility was turned over to Spider-Man after a prison riot caused its temporary closing. It was renamed Spider Island during this time. Actually, Spider Island 2, as Manhattan was briefly named Spider Island during the story of the same name. But since the true Peter Parker's return, the raft was rebuilt and is back serving its original purpose. Other prisons in the Marvel books include the Cube, originally designed for alien prisoners but now being used for any superpowered criminals, and the Big House, ironically named as the prison and all of its inhabitants are shrunken down to miniature size thanks to Pym particles. But they haven't had as many stories around them, so let's move on to DC. Not Washington, D.C., of course, but DC Comics. The first prison we'll be visiting is down in Louisiana, and is called Belle Reve. If you've watched either of the Suicide Squad movies, then that name may sound familiar. And it makes sense, as the first appearance of Belle Reve Prison was Suicide Squad issue number 1, volume 1, released in 1987. The history of the site was mostly told in the DC role-playing game book, The Atlas of the DC Universe, where we learn that construction on the prison was started on the site of a defunct plantation in the 1960s, but was abandoned due to budget cuts before its completion. A couple of decades later, Amanda Waller decided on the location as headquarters for Task Force X, aka the Suicide Squad, and construction was completed. Here, superhumans are held prisoner, and if deemed suitable for a particular mission, are sent out by Waller to act as Black Ops teams in exchange for a reduction in their sentences. Anyone imprisoned at the site also receives a bomb implanted in the base of their neck, which Waller can detonate at any time to ensure cooperation. Belle Reve has been a constant in the comics until its destruction in Suicide Squad number 14, volume 7, published in 2022, and has also shown up in almost every long-term adaptation of the DC universe, including the Smallville TV show, the DC Extended Universe, i.e. the 2 Suicide Squad movies, and the Arrowverse. Task Force X does appear in the DC Animated Universe, but we don't see Belle Reve in any of the Justice League episodes in which the squad shows up. Speaking of the Arrowverse, the other big DC superhuman prison was also seen in those shows, although it was originally a standard penitentiary when it first appeared there. Iron Heights is connected mainly to The Flash, both in the comics and the TV shows, although it is also a large part of Arrow's backstory as well in those CW shows. Iron Heights is a relatively recent addition to the DC universe, as it first appeared in an October 2001 book aptly titled The Flash, Iron Heights. Located just outside of Keystone City, the neighbor of Central City where the Flash resides, Iron Heights was built to house superhuman criminals, and with its location being so close to the home of the Flash, it was mostly his rogues gallery who populated the prison. However, in its very first appearance, we learn that the warden, Gregory Wolf, is treating the prisoners inhumanely, even using one as a power source for the entire prison by wiring him in place and absorbing the radiation he gives off. Eventually, he was incarcerated himself for the prisoner abuse performed at his hands. Although, due to cosmic entities known as the Lords of Order interfering, his conviction was eventually overturned and he became mayor of Central City. After Flash confronted the Lords of Order, Wolf has backed down somewhat on his cruel treatment of the rogues, and even allows some of them to act as sanctioned law enforcement officers if he believes them trustworthy enough to do so. Meanwhile, Iron Heights continues to be a presence in the comics as a detainment center for superhumans who won't follow the law. I could name a dozen or more other locations that serve as either a superhuman prison or for more standard criminals, from Blackgate and the Slab in DC to Red Sands and the Cage in Marvel, but most of these have only shown up in 1 or 2 appearances, so let's move on to our final major category. That being, as mentioned up top, the asylums. There's one major example of each for DC and Marvel, and in this case, DC is the definitive originator. Arkham Asylum, named after the fictional city that is the setting for many of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, is one of the many fixtures in the Batman mythos in nearly every interpretation over the years. Originally referred to as Arkham Hospital when it first appeared in Batman number 258 in October of 1974, it was renamed to the alliterative Arkham Asylum in Batman number 326, and that name has stuck ever since. Before that, mostly unnamed insane asylums and mental hospitals were referred to, but none ever became a permanent part of the DC universe. Over the years, the asylum itself has built up a rich history that begins with its construction in 1921. The founder of the asylum, Amadeus Arkham, ended up being one of its patients after the brutal murder of his wife and son drove him insane. His nephew Jeremiah took over after his death many years later. The Grant Morrison and Dave McKean book, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, tells much of the Arkham family story, and I don't want to spoil it for you, so definitely go check that out. Jeremiah had the asylum completely renovated, but unknowingly, multiple secret corridors were built into the facility, allowing for easy escape by Victor Zsasz, who blackmailed the construction foreman, and others. During the Nightfall storyline, Bane released dozens of patients, leading to Batman running a gauntlet of villains before confronting Bane himself, leading to the famous backbreaking issue. The asylum has been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times in different locations, currently with an Arkham Tower being located in the heart of Gotham itself. Now, what makes the asylum different from a standard prison? Well, ostensibly, if you're an inhabitant of Arkham, you are a patient rather than a prisoner. Those who are sent to Arkham rather than Blackgate or another local prison have been deemed mentally unfit or criminally insane. Now, the DC Universe's definition of this is obviously different from ours, as the real-world definition states to successfully plead insanity, you must prove that the plaintiff suffers from mental illness and that illness prevented them from either being able to determine right from wrong or to understand the actions they were undergoing when committing the crime or crimes. This is extraordinarily hard to prove in a real court of law, and is used very rarely, despite what we see in TV, movies, and comics. While characters like Scarface, who honestly believes the puppet on his arm is forcing him to commit criminal acts, may qualify for the real-world insanity defense, it would be much more difficult to show that's the case for the Riddler, Clayface, or Poison Ivy as a few examples. But in the world of Batman, all of these characters regularly are sent to Arkham for treatment, although how much actual treatment they receive varies greatly from story to story. There are psychiatrists on staff, otherwise we wouldn't have Harley Quinn's origin story, but usually the residents of Arkham are seen in solitary cells, kept apart from one another and from any significant rehabilitation efforts. While there are many improvements that can still be made, as mental hospitals have greatly improved since the 1920s, or even the 1970s when Arkham first appeared, my hope is these portrayals of Arkham Asylum become more and more anachronistic and out of place. Of course, Marvel does have its own version of the mental hospital, although ironically it started more modern and has since devolved into a more Arkham-like facility. First appearing in 1991's Spectacular Spider-Man number 178, written by J.M. DeMatteis with art by Sal Buscema. Go back to listen to my interview with J.M. in episodes 146 and 147. Ravencroft Institute was headed by Dr. Ashley Kafka, who through a series of chemical treatments and hypnotherapy had been slowly curing Edward Whalen, aka Vermin, of his rat-like transformation and cannibalistic tendencies. Spider-Man was reticent to believe such a creature could be redeemed, but soon came to trust Dr. Kafka, and later Edward himself, as a confidant and ally. Unfortunately, other inmates were not successfully cured, including Cletus Cassidy, aka Carnage, and Shriek, who successfully escaped the institution in the Maximum Carnage storyline. In fact, Vermin is probably the only true success story to come out of Ravencroft, as there have now been dozens of patients to be seen in the Institute, but few released of their own recognizance. In later storylines, almost 30 years after he was first admitted to the hospital, Carnage's backstory became intimately tied to Ravencroft Institute. In a retcon that brought it much closer to an Arkham-like backstory, it was revealed that the land Ravencroft was built on was cursed, having been built on the territory of a cult that worshipped Null, god of the symbiotes. In addition, Cletus's ancestor, Cortland, was the very first person held as a prisoner on those grounds, later escaping and killing his wife. Centuries later, Cletus's mother, Louise, was sent to the Institute and was given electroshock therapy while pregnant, later giving birth to the future serial killer while still incarcerated there. We learn most of this and other horrific details about the location in a series of one-shots released in 2020 with the Ruins of Ravencroft title, subtitled with various characters like Carnage, Dracula, and Sabretooth, who all interacted with the site in one way or another. Followed up by a 5-issue Ravencroft miniseries, all of which was written by Frank Thierry, with art credits by Angel Unzueta and Guru Villanova. The Institute has been destroyed twice, once leading to the Ruins of Ravencroft story, the other following the Last Remains storyline in Amazing Spider-Man, but was rebuilt both times and continues to be a combination hospital/prison for mentally ill criminals. But it seems unlikely at this point that it will ever return to the true place of healing it started as when we were first introduced to it. Well, as I said, there's no way to cover all of the prisons in comics, or even the big two, but I think this gives you a pretty good overview of some of the major ones you'll find. Thanks for the question, Scott, and as I said up top, while I'm winding things down here with this version of Welcome to Geektown, until I do, I'm open to any suggestions for topics you'd like to hear me discuss. You can email those or general feedback to welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome to Geektown, Twitter @Geektown Podcast, Mastodon @Welcome2Geektown @Mastodon.social, or Blue Sky @Welcome2Geektown.bluesky.social. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, why not become a patron at patreon.com/Welcome to Geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, Welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Lovitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.